Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and welcome to the reviews of the Enoch Seminar virtual book review session. My name is Dr. Joshua Scott. I'm the chief editor of the RES. We're very pleased to welcome you to this virtual review where we will discuss Dr. Bruner's new book, Messianic High Christology, New Testament Variants of Second Temple Judaism. RES is a digital review service of the Enoch Seminar that reviews recently published books. In service for over 11 years, the Review Journal distributes high-quality reviews that target works significant to our field of research, including works on the Hebrew Bible, pseudepigrapha, apocrypha, Qumran scrolls, as well as Christian, rabbinic, and Islamic literature. If you have recently published a book and would like us to consider it for review, or interested in writing reviews, please contact me by email. We have 5 reviews scheduled for 2023, and this is the third one. So we invite you to stay connected to RES through the Enoch Seminar webpage and the Facebook page. We invite today's participants to become members of the Enoch Seminar. Members receive special invitations to our events, quarterly emailings from our leadership, the ability to participate as a speaker at our events, pay reduced meeting registration fees, and list the Enoch Seminar officially on your CV. More information about Enoch Seminar membership is available on our websites, and I'll post that in the chats in a moment. We also thank our partners in academic pursuits, the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies and the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. We encourage all participants today to follow along with their work. I'm pleased to chair today's session. The review session will begin with a brief overview by Ruben of his book. We will then hear reviews from Dr. Rebecca Harris and Dr. Robin Walsh. After a short break, we will invite Ruben to respond, and then we will move then to open conversation. To focus our time on the book, we will only offer very brief introductions to today's speakers. We encourage all participants to engage the conversation through Zoom's chat function. And once we move to open discussion, we also invite participants to use the raised hand feature if they would like to join us on screen to engage the speakers directly. With those brief announcements, we are pleased now to begin with a brief introduction to the book by Ruben Bruner, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Zurich. Ruben, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Joshua, for that lovely introduction, and thanks to the Enoch Seminar, Gabriele, Joshua, for organizing these great virtual reviews, and of course, thanks for inviting me to discuss my book. So I'm delighted to get to share a brief overview on the topic and arguments I made in the book. Over the last few decades, there's been a lively discussion about the origin and development of the depiction of Jesus as divine, so what some call high Christology, within the first decades of the Jesus movement. Additionally, much work has been done on Messianic expectations of Second Temple Judaism. But despite the prolific work done in recent scholarship on these two subjects, research has largely treated them as two separate lines of inquiry. More specifically, the depiction of Christ as divine is mostly thought to be the categorical difference between early Jewish Messianism and New Testament Christology. Many publications within recent decades have focused on the Jewish roots of New Testament Christology, but only few have contextualized the divinity of Christ specifically within the diverse discourse of Second Temple Messianism. In this respect, the assessment, for example, of Richard Bauckham can be seen as representative for many scholars, according to whom, quote, early Christians said about Jesus what no other Jews had wished to say about the Messiah. And in a similar way, Magnus Zetterholm has commented in the introduction to a collected volume on Jewish and Christian Messianism, quote, the Messiah has been the most important concept that distinguishes Christianity from Judaism, end quote. Thus, Second Temple Messianism is at the most considered as an important impact only on the purely human or low aspects of New Testament Christologies. For instance, an impact of Second Temple Messianism is commonly seen in the portrayal of Christ as human king, as redeemer, or as a wise and prophetic teacher. However, the depiction of Christ as some kind of divine being is commonly thought to be a deviation from traditional Messiah language. In this context, my book argues with reference to different texts and aspects that at least some of the depiction of Jesus's superhuman or even divine status in the New Testament are rooted within early Jewish Messianic expectations. The texts relevant to this investigation come from a broad and very diverse field. On the one side, texts within the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint that are interpreted as Messianic texts already contain the notion of a figure that is in some way pre-existent, heavenly, or called Son of God or angel. This can be seen, for example, in some of the royal psalms in Isaiah 9 or the prophet Elijah in the book of Malachi. Furthermore, some texts from the so-called pseudepigrapha, like 4th Ezra, 2nd Baruch, or the parables of Enoch, document a messianic figure who is linked to the one like a son of man in Daniel 7, and is depicted as being located in heavens, whose coming on earth is accompanied with typical signs of theophanies, or who has superhuman power. And finally, as a third category, there are also texts within the Dead Sea Scrolls, such as the Midrash on Melchizedek, which expect an angelic or celestial messianic figure who is confronted by another angelic being, such as Belial. Now, it is important to note the diverse superhuman characteristics of messianic figures in those texts do not amount to a constant and distinct early Jewish expectation of a divine Messiah. However, very different kinds of messianic figures in the Second Temple period are more frequently depicted with superhuman traits than is recognized in contemporary scholarship. That is to say, the expectation of a heavenly, pre-existent, or in some other way superhuman Messiah is part of the lively and diverse messianic discourse of Second Temple Judaism. Now, my book is not an attempt to deny that different developments can be seen within the New Testament, or that at least some of these high Christologies go beyond the evidence we have about Second Temple Messianism. Rather, my goal in my book is to show that those developments within the early Jesus movement are an outgrowth of or in reach of Jewish ideas and expectations which can be found outside the early Jesus movement. I intend to demonstrate the extent to which the various high Christologies found in the New Testament should be read as not only rooted within, but as an integral part of contemporary early Jewish Messianic discourse. In order to demonstrate the Jewishness and the Messianic character of high Christology, I present a set of comparisons in my book, each between a high Christological text of the New Testament and one or two Messianic texts from the Second Temple Judaism. In almost all of these comparisons, it can be stated with certainty that there is no literary dependency between them. Thus, my point is not to claim a linear development from one text to the other, nor to investigate the general development of early Christology. The comparisons provided in my book give evidence to strikingly similar ideas and motives, and the best explanation for this affinity, as I argue, is to assume that those different Messianic and Christological texts take part in a highly related discourse of 1st century CE. My overall aim is simply to demonstrate the fact that Second Temple Messianism is indeed the primary context, even for the high Christologies found in the New Testament. With respect to the text from the New Testament, my book focuses on the hymn in Paul's letter to the Philippians, on Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin according to the Gospel of Mark. The book has a chapter on Jesus' virginal conception in the Lucan birth narrative and on the visionary image of the throne in Revelations 4-5. Finally, I discuss the prologue of the Gospel of John, which is not only widely believed to have been written relatively late, but also to present one of the most exalted Christologies within the New Testament. Now, my book contains a lot of exegetical arguments and philological details, which I, of course, cannot repeat here. But as a form of conclusion, I want to say my reading suggests that the earliest followers of Jesus were aware of divine messianic discourses of their times. They deliberately developed their Christologies in acceptance of and in dialogue with this discourse. In doing so, they adopted, developed, and deduced from earlier messianic models, and sometimes they creatively invented new motives in order to present their distinctive high Christologies. That is to say, when the earliest followers of Jesus developed their Christologies, they did so within the already given linguistic metrics of early Jewish hopes for a superhuman Messiah. For the various New Testament Christologies to be part of the broader Messianic discourse of their time, it's not necessary to point to a one-to-one parallel of each superhuman attribute which is assigned to Jesus. Instead, what makes even the later Christological developments within the New Testament part of Second Temple Messianism is the fact that they deliberately engage within this common discourse. That is, they take the given linguistic metrics of earlier Messianic traditions as the starting point for their new Messianic variants, even though they develop traditional motives further and sometimes include new motives into the discourse. Within the diversity of Second Temple Judaism in general and of Second Temple Messianism in particular, expectations of a superhuman Messiah never represented the whole Messianic discourse, but were a contested minority position within a diverse debate. It is precisely within this earlier and inner Jewish debate about the theological legitimacy of applying divinity to a Messianic figure that we should understand the Gospel's narratives about Jesus's opponents. He's charged with blasphemy and finally given the death sentence because the Jewish majority, or at least the contemporary Jewish elite, did not agree with such claims. What started as a contested minority view within Second Temple Messianism gained more and more followers with the rise of the early Jesus movement. Whereas such a view was already contested before Jesus' days, the debate about its theological legitimacy came into focus with the growing Jesus movement. It was not until the second and subsequent centuries that Jews, as well as non-Jewish followers of Christ, began to consider the divinity of a Messiah as a decisive criterion regarding the distinctiveness of what would develop later into two separate religions. What began as a minority view within Second Temple Messianism only later became an issue on which grounds Jews and Christians respectively expressed their categorical difference or disparity. Recent scholarship has accepted this second and later center review too easily, as I argue, and wrongly as the background of the earliest Christological concepts of the first decades of the Jesus movement. Viewing the high Christologies of the New Testament as variants of Second Temple Messianism changes our understanding of their correlation with each other. That is, scholarly assumptions which depict early Jewish Messianism and New Testament Christology as mutually exclusive are to be withdrawn. The depiction of Christ as divine should no longer be thought to be the categorical difference between early Jewish Messianism and New Testament Christology. Likewise, the depiction of Christ as divine is neither a Christian innovation, nor was it only possible through a secondary shift from the Jesus movement towards a rather Hellenistic and at the same time un-Jewish context. Instead, not only Christology in general, but especially the high Christological characteristics of it developed within the diverse discourse of Second Temple Messianism. Such a reading brings the New Testament Christologies closer to their first century Jewish context with which they are organically connected. This challenges our historical reconstructions. For many superhuman aspects which are attributed to Jesus, there's no longer the need to see their emergence as only possible after a long process of Christological developments. It even might be possible to argue that some belief in the superhuman character of Christ go back to the time of the historical Jesus. The least we must say is that with respect to Jesus' claims of his superhuman messiahship, that the canonical gospels have chosen the narratives which could have occurred in the first century CE. If the hope for an otherworldly Messiah was part of the diverse discourse of Second Temple Messianism, then it is not impossible in historical terms that the Jew in the first century CE was believed to be one such otherworldly or otherwise superhuman figure, even within his own lifetime. Read in its first century Jewish context, we should therefore depict and interpret the various New Testament high Christologies, or maybe we should prefer the term Christian messianisms, primarily as possible variants of messianic hopes in the first century CE. That's in short kind of an overview of what I try to argue in my book.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Ruben. We'll now turn to Dr. Rebecca Harris, Assistant Professor of Biblical and Religious Studies at Messiah University. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Buna for this deeply insightful and carefully presented work on the development of New Testament Christologies. Your concern for showing how these Christologies developed within early Jewish contexts is certainly timely, considering recent discussions in the Enoch Seminar of New Testament texts and figures within Judaism. But more importantly, it responds to a certain lack or neglect in scholarship regarding how exactly New Testament Christologies, and particularly high Christologies, are related to Jewish Messianism. For those who may not yet have had a chance to read Dr. Buna's book, it is very methodically organized. Each chapter begins with a New Testament text that represents a certain belief in Jesus' divinity or portrays Jesus with certain superhuman traits, with superhuman referring to aspects beyond the normal human condition. Dr. Buna then brings this text into conversation with a couple of early Jewish texts that reflect similar ideas or representations. I think one of the great strengths of Dr. Buna's book is that he does not force the pieces to fit. That is, he does not assume a direct equivalence where it does not exist, but rather draws our attention to how the themes and ideas already present in Second Temple Jewish Messianism might be related to the development of New Testament Christologies. In the next few minutes, I'd like to highlight what I found to be some of the most interesting and important observations in the study, and offer a few thoughts or questions that were prompted by Dr. Buna's discussion. To begin, I found the distinction between superhuman and divine traits to be a helpful starting point for this sort of study. As Dr. Buna points out, the diversity or range of early Jewish monotheistic beliefs and practices cautions against a unitary understanding of the difference between the one God and other types of divine beings. The decision to use superhuman expands the selection of texts and ideas that might be considered in relation to early Christologies. Superhuman, following Dr. Buna's definition, quote, can refer to a figure's spatial or temporal characteristics. For example, if a figure is said to live forever or to have been pre-existent in the heavenly realm, end quote. These spatial and temporal aspects are especially relevant to the discussion of texts like the Self-Glorification Hymn, 4th Ezra, and the Parables of Enoch. In the first chapter, certain superhuman traits identified with Christ in Philippians 2, 6-11, and shared by the speaker of the Self-Glorification Hymn and a figure in the Midrash on Melchizedek, are presented as part of the first century Messianic context of the Philippians 2 hymn. One of the things I appreciate about this chapter, which is really characteristic of the entire monograph, is that it brings into conversation texts that are not often considered together because they lack evidence of literary or historical dependence. Yet, as Dr. Buna demonstrates, such texts and ideas may be mutually illuminating because they share a common linguistic matrix and thought world. In the case of Philippians 2 and the version of the Self-Glorification Hymn preserved in 4Q 491c, there's at least the possibility that in both texts that the nature of the exalted figure changes. Here, Dr. Buna points to the use of conventional monotheistic language as, quote, the ambiguous way in which both texts combine the notion of the uniqueness of God with the unique exalted status of their messianic figure, end quote. In regard to this comparison, I think Dr. Buna makes a compelling claim that is well stated in his conclusion, that, quote, the exaltation in the Self-Glorification Hymn shows that it was possible within the Messianic discourse to talk about a figure's exaltation into the heavenly sphere without clarifying any details about the nature of this figure, end quote. While I am thoroughly convinced of the appropriateness of viewing these texts together, and I'm grateful to Dr. Buna for offering such a careful analysis, I wonder to what extent the context of the Self-Glorification Hymn should inform the degree to which it might be considered a messianic text. In other words, how might the shape and placement of the hymn in a text like 1QHA, which is often viewed as a liturgical text, impact the ways in which the exaltation of the speaker is understood in relation to the exaltation of Christ in Philippians 2. Although such considerations do appear to be on the scope of the present work, Dr. Buna acknowledges a likely liturgical function of the Self-Glorification Hymn, both as it appears in the Hodayot and if 4Q 491c is read in the context of the War Scroll. Considering the text in this sort of liturgical context, I'm a little uneasy about identifying the Self-Glorification Hymn as a representation of Jewish Messianism, although I see the value of reading 4Q 491c alongside a text like Philippians 2, as an example of the exaltation of a figure to divine or a divine-like status. I'm curious if Dr. Buna or others have additional thoughts on how a liturgical context of the Self-Glorification Hymn might impact the way in which it relates to Jewish Messianic discourse. Among the many illuminative points of connection in this study that are worth reflecting on, I was especially intrigued by the discussion of the Son of Man discourse in Mark as it relates to early Jewish interpretations of Daniel 7:13. Though I won't be commenting on this part of the study, I greatly appreciate Dr. Buna's attention to the ways in which Messianic readings of certain texts like Daniel 7:13 and Psalm 110 might provide a context for the Christological claims of Mark 14. My final remarks pertain to the discussion in chapter 3 of Luke's development of the divine sonship motif. This was, for me, one of the most interesting parts of the study because of the range of potential parallels that were offered, as well as how they might point to opportunities for future engagement on this topic. In this chapter, Dr. Buna discusses Luke's presentation of the virginal conception of Christ in relation to both early Jewish and Greco-Roman representations of divine sonship. Possible parallels for the notion of divine conception included the Enochic Watcher tradition, Greek and Roman myths, and early Jewish interpretations of Isaac's conception in Genesis 21. References to virginal conception, however, are more scarce, with a Messianic reading of Isaiah 7:14, the virgin will become pregnant, serving as the sole example. Luke's presentation of Christ's divine conception as rooted in a divine origin is, in Dr. Buna's estimation, an indication that, quote, Luke is clearly moving toward an ontological understanding of Jesus' divine sonship, end quote. This seems to me to be a significant development distinct from notions of divine sonship related to adoption. Dr. Buna, I wonder if you might be able to say more about possible motivations for this shift in Luke, why Luke is concerned with establishing Jesus' origins in a certain type of divine activity. For instance, you mentioned the Enochic Watcher tradition as a possible, though doubtful, parallel to Jesus' divine conception in Luke. Doubtful because the offspring of the union between the angelic and human beings are pictured in negative terms and are depicted with a hybrid appearance. Considering a possible relationship between the two traditions another way, might the Lucan model of divine conception offer a sort of reversal to the Watcher tradition? Whereas divine begetting in the Watcher tradition results in destruction, in Luke it leads to salvation. Or perhaps Luke's model of divine conception seeks to identify Jesus' nature as distinct from models of human transformation that result in a form of divinization. Along these lines, I think of the 7 brothers in 4th Maccabees, who, following their martyrdoms, are rebirthed into immortality and described as star-like, or the speaker of the Self-Glorification Hymn, who assumes a position among or above the Elim. I wonder if Jesus' divine conception in Luke is a means of establishing Jesus as ontologically distinct from examples of divinization achieved through human transformation. I'd be curious to hear any additional thoughts you might have regarding possible motivations for Luke's concern with Jesus' origins. To conclude, I wish to emphasize the value of Dr. Buna's approach in locating New Testament high Christologies within the matrix of early Jewish Messianism. I think the significance of this study is best summarized in Dr. Buna's own words on page 193, where he writes, reading the New Testament's concepts of Jesus' divinity in light of their first century context, that is, in light of Second Temple Messianism, not only illuminates their historical plausibility, but is a necessary prerequisite for us to fully understand their meaning and implications. A task Dr. Buna claims does not deny the distinctiveness of New Testament Christology, but can help us point to the places where these distinctive elements can be found. Thank you, Dr. Buna, for this important and carefully researched study, which has challenged us to think more broadly about the ways in which New Testament high Christologies might have emerged, from early Jewish Messianic discourse. Your thoughtful analysis has provided a helpful model for considering these relationships, while being careful not to gloss over elements that are distinctive to the various representations of Jewish Messianism and New Testament Christologies. I'm grateful for the lines of discussion you've introduced, and I look forward to hearing from others as we continue this important conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harris. We now turn to Dr. Robin Walsh, Associate Professor of Early Christianity and New Testament at the University of Miami. Robin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I am actually going to share my screen rather than prepare formal remarks that I would read. I've put together a few slides to try to keep me on task. So let me begin here. I don't know if you can you see my screen?
We can see it. Yep.
Perfect. Okay, great. So first, of course, thank you so much for this invitation. So Joshua, thank you for thinking of me to respond to this wonderful book. And I'm so pleased, Dr. Booner, to be able to interface with your work here. So thank you for such an interesting study, such an engrossing book. And also, Rebecca, thank you, or Dr. Harris, thank you for your remarks as well, because I pretty much figured out that I'd be going second. And so that allowed me to take a little bit of a different tact with my approach here. So thank you for your wonderful remarks as well. So thank you again for having me here. Now, I think my the most constructive thing that I can do in my response is to, of course, interface with the book, but also bring up some key discussion points. And in terms of my own expertise as somebody who works on the Gospels, who works on Paul, to bring up a few points of discussion that ties the material that is so expertly presented in the book to issues in the broader Greco-Roman world. And I think that one of the benefits of the book was the way in which I think that Dr. Harris, you put this perfectly. It's not an attempt to try to say that there is a one-to-one comparison going on between the texts in question. I think that at certain points, Matthew Novinson's work was invoked in terms of the idea of linguistic communities. And so we can think about these linguistic matrices or linguistic communities that give us a clue in the Second Temple context of what kind of, if not literary borrowing, conceptual borrowing is going on. I think that that is a completely fair point, and I don't dispute any aspect of that. However, I found that many of the, let's call them open questions, or at least some points of dislocation that were raised in the book can more easily be explained by broadening our scope into, again, the larger Greco-Roman world, but also making sure, or at least being attentive to the idea that we cannot really effectively separate Judaism from, let's call it Hellenism, or the Greco-Roman context of the ancient Mediterranean fully. And I think that's especially the case when we're talking about figures like Paul. Philo is often invoked in the book as well. And then, of course, we've already talked a little bit about Mark and Luke here. And especially because someone like Paul, for instance, we know is reading the Septuagint, but is highly influenced by Middle Platonic and Stoic thought. Now, this is something that comes up later in the book, especially in the latter chapters of the book, where there is a discussion of Philo. There's a discussion, especially around some of the issues of sonship, and then later on with the Logos in the Gospel of John. There is discussion of whether or not Logos is an operational category that should be understood within John, vis-a-vis that larger Greco-Roman context of philosophical thought. And beyond that, which is a discussion point we might want to bring up a little bit later on, the other thing is the concept of spirit, or pneuma, which goes untranslated in the book. So I would like to raise those issues and think a little bit more broadly about some of these categories, just again, for discussion point and interface with the text. So first, a couple of global points. The first is the question of pre-existence, which comes up quite a bit, questions of divination. I would point out that for Paul thinks he was predetermined to be the apostle to the Gentiles. He says this in Romans 15. He also equates Jesus and Abraham often, and that their faithfulness is the predicate for being the ones that end up ushering in this new age, or establishing God's covenant with his people. And so that is one issue that I would just like to put out there for discussion, that when we're thinking about the ontological status of these characters, that it seems that Paul thinks that all of this is to some degree faded, we might say. So that was the first kind of global point that I wanted to bring up. Oh, let's see here. I picked this image, you might imagine, or might be able to guess, because of this discussion of the cosmos, which comes up quite a bit in the book. And so as you see here, of course, you have Christ flanked not only by the Alpha and Omega, but also stars. And this question of, this heavenly Christ and the significance of the heavenly Christ comes up throughout the book as well. This is something that I think is quite significant because we have multiple Greek and Roman sources, and let me focus here mostly, in the first century context if I possibly can, but I have a quote, and I'll just bring it up now to make sure that I cover it, by Plutarch, for instance, where he talks about how there are daimons, and he uses the word saviors who exist in the heavens, along with other kinds of spirits, we might say, or other kinds of supernatural beings that elect to intercede in human events. And so this idea that you would have a heavenly figure, a daimon or something along those lines that has that particular kind of heavenly ontological status, this is not unusual in the Greco-Roman world by any means. And I think, again, that Dr. Buhner brings in excellent examples from the Second Temple context, but I think that we can effectively broaden this out as well. So Paul, I already mentioned that he talks in Romans in particular about this idea of, we might call it predestination, or at least the idea that we have to create some space in our minds for the idea that all of these figures, including Christ, are to some degree already determined before their birth to be figures that are going to have some kind of intercession in human events. But I also wanted to think about Paul, because at certain points in the book, there's this idea that Mark is a very different portrayal of Christ. Another question I'd like to raise is, although I think at one point you mentioned the idea of systematic theology, that even though we have a slightly different presentation in Mark of Jesus, because you do not have the birth narrative, that we can sort of collapse these ideas together so that you can fruitfully compare the synoptics, especially together, to get an idea of Christ's status, especially vis-a-vis the birth narrative and the idea of sonship. I would just like to push on that a little bit, because I think there is more in common between someone like Paul and the canonical Gospels, particularly as it concerns this concept of pneuma, or of spirit. So don't worry about all these slides. We might be able to come back to them. Let me go ahead to just, let me see here. Well, I guess I'll go to this one. And then I'll go back. But the idea of spirit, this idea that's used among ancient philosophers, and here I'm thinking about Middle Platonists and Stoics to mean things like concepts like wind, air, breath, fire, spirit, anything that animates, pervades, activates. When that word is being used, when, for example, in Mark, it comes down like a dove and endows Jesus with God's pneuma, with God's spirit, in order to become his son, I think that's something that we do have to consider, because I think it also gives us some clarity on what goes on, for example, in the Gospel of Luke. At various points in the book, you mentioned that the supernatural birth is not sexualized, and therefore can't really have much to do with the Greco-Roman world more generally, and the birth narratives that you find, say, in mythology. By contrast, there have been a number of scholars who have talked about this, including David Litwa, and I just have a quick screen grab actually from his book on this issue, where we do, because of our understanding of what pneuma means, have understandings of how that kind of process can take place, pneumatic pregnancy in the ancient world. And I think it can bring a lot more texture to the way that we might understand something like the Holy Spirit as it functions both in Paul, Mark, Luke, as an active principle for initiating Christ into the kind of divine scope in which you set forth in the book. So I'll just, again, leave this up here for a moment, but we have this idea of pneumatic contact. You have the same kind of discourse going on, say, in Luke. You have a different kind of discourse, obviously not pneumatic pregnancy, but the idea of pneumatic endowment of specialized status in Mark for Jesus. And so I think that these ideas, again, can help us understand a little bit more about how Christ as a figure functions. in these texts. Again, adding a little bit more to what you've already so expertly provided with your comparisons with the Second Temple literature. All right, now I know I've been darting around a little bit, but let me just go back for a moment. This slide is only to indicate that, as I mentioned before, I think we need to be careful not to separate Second Temple discourse from the broader Greco-Roman world, in part because Stoicism, especially its principles of the idea of an all-powerful God controlling the cosmos, interacting with humans, that there's a certain fate determinism, human beings are required to act morally according to nature, that there are cosmic cycles. These are all ideas that I think are featured within Judaism as well. And so the reason that I think someone like Paul or Philo is able to see that these are congruous ideas and are able to sample technical terms from the philosophical catalog of terminology, words like logos, words like pneuma, is because I'm not sure that they would have meaningfully distinguished that this is a kind of discourse that is confined only to Greek and Roman thought, but not to Jewish thought. So I think that it would be helpful to hear some of your thoughts on how spirit functions in these texts. At various points too, you mentioned that logos doesn't really correspond to what you see going on in the text, although I think that logos within Stoic thought in particular has a little bit more nuance to it, which does make it function, I think, quite effectively within the Gospel of John as a technical concept that is probably borrowing from philosophical literature. I think it's something that these authors are, again, well acquainted with, especially authors like Paul and Mark and Luke. And I think John, I think all these New Testament authors are well acquainted with this literature. I think that readers would have been acquainted with the concepts as well. So I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts on that. And so if I go back to, I was thinking about, as I mentioned before, broader Greco-Roman thought that I think you also see in authors like Philo about the idea of heavenly beings existing in the ether anyway. And we know this from Paul too, because we have not only ideas about, this was just a quote from 2 Corinthians about the eternal heavens, but I'll go back to, this one, famously in 2 Corinthians, Paul talking about the different, the starry heavens and these different levels of the heavens. And so the famous quote about how he knows somebody who's gone up to the third heaven, he's not sure if he was in his body or not, on this very complicated passage. But we know that there's discourse within Paul, but again, broader Greco-Roman discourse, but within early Christianity about the idea of the heavens having these kinds of different registers. About this idea that the quote unquote heavens, so this region between the earth and the moon especially, has great significance in human events. And so that you would have a heavenly figure, especially an enthroned figure, and here I'm thinking about your comments on Revelation, that would have been able to kind of marshal a heavenly army and come back down to earth. This is not restricted just to mythology or restricted to the Second Temple context of literature. So I was hoping to hear a little bit more about what you think about that. Okay, so let me just kind of wrap up my thoughts there. I was thinking about 1 Thessalonians as well, this idea that those who are going to be seized up into the air for a meeting with the Lord. I was thinking that I would love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on beyond Philippians, what you think of some of these other clues, breadcrumbs that Paul leaves us about his cosmology, because again, I think that's then reflected in the other gospel authors and can, as a piece, demonstrate that there's a more complex cosmology going on here that's not just confined to a linguistic community, but a broader ancient Mediterranean idea of what's going on in the quote unquote heavens. And then finally, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what you talk in the conclusion and near the end of the monograph about when you might detect a split between Judaism and what we will call Christianity, more of a divergence of paths after you've done all of this excellent comparative work within the Second Temple context. One thing I would love to hear from you is how you think the Jewish war impacts this. So beyond just what's going on in these texts and the comparative efforts, how do you see some of the sociological activity or historical action on the ground, things like losing the temple, impacting what we then eventually see within quote unquote Christian discourse? Okay, I prepared way more slides than I needed to in the end, but thank you for your patience in listening to some of these rambling thoughts, but I very much enjoyed the book and look forward to our conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Robin. I'd now propose that we take a very short break. We usually do this a little bit later based on time, but to give Ruben a chance to think about those questions and allow them to percolate, let's take a 5-minute break. I have 9:41 my time. I'm in Central Time, so let's meet back at 46. Okay, 9:46 or whatever time you're at. So I'll see you in 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your comments, Robin. I love these conversations, but also you raised a lot of significant points over a very broad spectrum, and that's really helpful. I especially appreciate
You know, I mean, that was the only contribution I thought I could really make, is to broaden us out to the technical terminology, you know.
No, that's great. I especially appreciate your question about what we would call parting of the ways, about how Messianic discourse affected that division. So I feel like, and I could be wrong, I mean, my own book works on Messianic discourse and Second Temple period. I feel like we stop at the Gospels frequently, end of first century. Yeah. There's this question about projection, about how that language continues to affect Jews in ancient Judea and around the Mediterranean.
Absolutely, and you know, the thing is that I published something a long time ago now, and it's always kind of bothered me, and it's something I'm returning to because I'm writing for the Oxford Handbook on Q Studies. And the canonical Gospels, there's no temple. I mean, like, he goes to the temple, but none of the teachings require the temple, so it's clearly gone. Right. And that's something that, you know, it's interesting that Paul doesn't interface with that much either, of course, but that is, to me, significant for thinking about, you know, for if we're correct in our, I mean, certainly Paul, but if we're correct in our dating for the canonical Gospels, I mean, it's the first century, they're Jewish texts, right? So it's a different kind of view, but I'm just interested in that kind of source material and context, obviously. So it'll be fun to have that discussion, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
I had a 28-page thing on space. I was like, well, I can't read that. So I'll just mention pneuma. Oh, Paula, Matthew does have temple teachings. Matthew has temple teachings. Which beyond Jesus in the temple? Got it.
Very good. Well, we will formally begin again. Just to reiterate our procedures, we will invite Ruben to respond and have a dialogue with Rebecca and Robin, and then we'll open up the conversation to the whole audience. Again, we invite you to use the chat to contribute your questions and comments, and also use that raised hand feature if you'd like to join us on screen during the open conversation. This is meant as a dialogue, as a conversation, and so I will try to guide the conversation minimally to allow it to develop organically. So Ruben, why don't we begin with you, and we welcome your responses to Rebecca and Robin.
Yeah, thanks Rebecca and Robin, for both of you, for your reviews and for engaging with my thoughts and my arguments. Yeah, a lot of questions and issues came up, some more detailed, some maybe more general, and I don't think it's probably wise if I answer all of them right now. So I'll start with those questions. I think I've got something to answer, and so then we'll just move on, and you might have to repeat another questions again, otherwise nobody will able to follow us. So first, Rebecca, the Self-Glorification Hymn. So you argued that it's a liturgical text, and it might be not as clear if it's really a Messianic text. And I totally agree with you. And I do hope I say this in my book, that it's a really complicated text. We don't know much about it. I'm not sure if it's a Messianic text. I think that's one possible reading. Others have different interpretations, like to say that the one reciting the hymn identifies it's himself or herself with the eyes or with the speaker in the text. That's possible as well. And then we would have a totally different context than a Messianic context. But still, it would be in some way illuminating to compare simply the ideas found in the hymn with what we find in New Testament Christology. But of course, it's not. This text is really complicated. We actually don't know much about its context. I totally agree with you. Yeah. So the divine sonship in Luke, where I argue that it's kind of ontological because of the virginal birth and how it's presented in Luke. Your question was why Luke is moving in this kind of direction. So why is he insisting on a kind of an ontological form of divine sonship? And I think your idea with connected, that it might be connected to the Watcher tradition, I think that's kind of a right way we could go on. So I think it's connected to traditions like the Watcher tradition and maybe even the Theodicee Christian. So it's like, as soon as people start in Second Temple Judaism to argue that everything bad in the world is due to some bad angels or whatever, or other bad figures in the celestial sphere, it's simply logical that we need a redeemer figure or messianic figure who can fight against those. So he also has to be some kind of superhuman or divine. So I do think there's a connection between the Watcher tradition or what we can find there and all this Theodicee Christian and the necessity to have a Messiah or to portray Jesus Christ as also some kind of more than human, superhuman, or yeah. So I do think, yeah, that's right. Maybe one other question, Robin, you always you argued or insisted that the broader Greco-Roman world and its tradition is also really important for New Testament Christologies to read and understand them. And on a general level, I will totally agree with you. So my point is not to say that the New Testament authors weren't acquainted with forms of Middle Platonism or with the broader Greco-Roman ideas. I totally agree with you, especially John, but also Mark and Paul. They they were acquainted with these traditions, and when they formulated their Christology, they did this also in dialogue with this broader tradition. What I want to argue simply is that earlier Messianic texts, outside the New Testament, and their authors were also already acquainted with the broader Greco-Roman world. So what I argue against is that I don't think it's helpful to think about a second major shift between, let's say, Jesus and Second Temple Judaism and the New Testament authors, which goes way beyond Judaism into a totally Greco-Roman sphere or world. So I simply think Second Temple Judaism is Hellenized. I mean, all those Messianic texts are in some way informed by Greco-Roman ideas of the pneuma and ideas about divine sonship and ideas about cosmology. And I think it's this kind of Second Temple Judaism, which is already Hellenized, in which the New Testament authors also fit in. So this said on a general level, then I do think we have some texts in the New Testament which go more beyond the Greco-Roman side, and others which are maybe less Hellenized, if we want to use this term. So obviously, let's say the Gospel of John or whatever operates within its Christology more with Middle Platonism and ideas like that than other authors do. But what I simply try to argue that the simple fact that John is acquainted with Middle Platonism and that the Logos also is understandable for people which come from Platonism or whatever does not necessarily mean that this is no longer a form of Second Temple Judaism. So that's the direction I simply argue. Yeah. So maybe I start with these responses, and I'm interested to hear what you respond.
Robin and Rebecca, do you want to respond to those reflections?
I can just briefly. Ruben, thank you for that clarification, the Self-Glorification Hymn. I remember you pointed to a few authors who do argue that the text might be used as a way of eliciting a sort of experiential thing among those that are perhaps participating in the hymn. And I think my thought there was kind of connected to the idea that comes up in Luke, just regarding this distinction between a divinization that can happen through transformation, perhaps even if the Self-Glorification Hymn was used liturgically, maybe not just for the speaker, but perhaps as a way of attempting to enact that for others as well. But that's sort of a divinization compared to in Luke. And I love that Robin brought up Mark too, the pneuma coming in to Jesus as a different form of divinization or expressing divinization in the Gospels. Your book just got me thinking a little bit more about the distinction among how divinization occurs or different forms of divinization, perhaps. And it just prompted more questions around why does Luke go the route of divine conception versus a divinization that happens through something more like Mark with the pneuma coming in, or in 4th Maccabees, where they're transformed into immortality and become star-like, or the Self-Glorification Hymn, where there seems to be this exaltation, this change in status and transformation that occurs. And I'm sorry, I don't have more to offer at that point, but it brought up a lot of really good questions, I think, around why were those distinctions a concern, particularly for someone like Luke?
I'll just say that, let me say plainly up front that it's a total pet peeve when, for me, when I see a scholar come in and be like, well, you didn't write the book. This is what I wanted to see in the book. So I hope I can distinguish that I'm not trying to do that by any means, because I think the way that you've established, as again, you use the phrase linguistic community or the linguistic matrix here, I think that's a major contribution, and you've certainly identified some very impressive comparative work with the literature that's available within that 2nd century context. The only thing I'm trying to highlight is that I don't think, even within that approach, I don't think that we can ignore the fact that all of the Christian material, all of it that you raise in the book, uses Greco-Roman philosophical terminology. And I'm even uncomfortable using that phrase, because I think it's all terminology that's obviously operational within, it's not exclusive to one group or the other. And especially, again, for someone like Paul, for Philo, we know that this is the case, but I would add the gospel writers to this, because the way that the pneuma comes down and mixes So hexis, if I'm thinking, in philosophical terms, with Jesus to turn him into God's son, is the same principle that functions in Luke. It just happens at birth or at conception, not at baptism. So they're just different moments, but it's all the same concept within Middle Platonic thought. So that's the thing I just wanted to raise, because the word spirit and Holy Spirit in the book, you call it an expression. You say that on page 100, and you don't it goes untranslated, or you refer to it as something as God's work on earth, but you don't explain what it is. And so that, again, is not a criticism. It's not the objective of the book, but I don't think that we can separate these discourses either and still have a full conceptual picture of what is going on for the gospel authors and for Paul, because all of these things, the terminology, the cosmology, the Christology, all of it is of a piece, and all that language is there. And the way that these philosophical concepts function are all there. Now, there's another piece of this, which is something that Arthur Urbano has written about, and others, Dan Alucci, Emma Wasserman, the Jen Isle, where the terminology is being taken by, let's call them Second Temple figures, like the gospel authors, like Paul. Again, we can add Philo to the mix to say whatever the Stoics think, whatever the Middle Platonists think, we've had it first in our literature. And so you may give it a term like pneuma, but we already knew this well before you ever, were using this term, Plutarch, or, whoever, right? So there's a little bit of cultural competition. We could frame it that way if we want to going on as well. So rather than see these as distinct, I would just like to have a conversation, or at least, again, just highlight that these things, I think, have to be integrated in a certain way to have a more holistic picture of what's going on in the text.
Thank you, Robin. Your comments raised a question that I had myself. You mentioned at the very beginning talking about linguistic communities and gave various references to the different groups. Ruben, that's a question I had about your text as well. You talked about linguistic communities, but you also said there's no literary dependency, but there's a similarity of ideas or motives at different places throughout the book. I thought you did very well in respective chapters where you had laid out an idea, and at the conclusion, you trying to make it clear, like, oh, this is a connection of an idea or motive, but it's not a literary dependence. Could you say more about what are linguistic communities for you? Are there boundaries to them, ideological boundaries to them? Here I'm thinking of Matthew Novinson's work, who he was here, but he wasn't able to join us. He talks about the grammar, the grammar of Messianism, that has certain dynamics. There's poles involved. All Messianism is between this or that in various ways, and that manner kind of sets out limitations about what Messianism is and how it is used in texts. Could you help me understand what you mean by linguistic communities in further detail? You make it very clear Paul probably knew of an idea like the Glorification Hymn or different parts from Qumran that the gospel authors knew about or were connected to in some way, the ideological developments. But could you say more about the dynamics of that?
Yeah, so what I think it's important to distinguish between the literary dependency and what I call with Matthew Novincin the linguistic community or the like is, so there might have been that many Second Temple Jewish texts we don't know anymore. So maybe we have only 2, 1, or 3%. Nobody knows. So I think searching for literary dependency does not account for our methodological problem that we simply don't know what else texts did exist. So, but talking about linguistic community tries to go beyond this methodological problems to say people might have known similar ideas, although they didn't know this text. And especially with respect to Messianism, I mean, I think it's compelling to think of that people might have known about others who thought about a Messiah in this or that way, even if they themselves didn't agree with such ideas. So a few decades ago, we had in the research a discussion: was Messianism even a broad concept? Did people even know about Messianism? And I think so. If we take this approach, and we could say maybe not that many Jews in the Second Temple period believed or hoped for a Messiah, but still, most of them might have known that what a Messiah is. If you have just talked to them, look, here's a Messiah, they would have said, no, he isn't, and there won't be any, but he would still know what it is. And I think it's this kind of linguistic community. So people are able to use words and understand each other and use similar concepts and motives and ideas, whether they agree with each other or not. Yeah. Does this make sense? Or?
Yeah, that does make sense. I'm thinking of Pierre Bardot's work and my own work by extension that argues that all discourse has power involved into it. There's strategization that happens in language. Suffering servant of Isaiah is a good example. In my opinion, the suffering servant in Isaiah gets broadened out to not an individual, but all of Israel. And then we have in 3rd Isaiah an extension of how then Israel is reimagined. Messianic discourse, I should say. Messianic discourse, I think, always has some sort of social purpose or context that can't be abstracted from. So at least for me, one thing that I appreciated about your book is the use of linguistic communities, but it also made me wonder about the limitations of that language and that methodological approach. Can messianism be abstracted from community? I guess is what I'm trying to say. When we talk about it as an idea, do we lose something about how it functions within these texts? Does that make sense?
Yeah. If I got you right, it goes similar than the argument Matthew Navinson makes in his Grammar of Messianism, or yeah.
Yeah, a similar question about usage and how it's functioning.
Yeah.
Gabriele, you had some comments. We turn to you now.
Robert, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And as you know, I'm speaking from Camaldoli, which is a place where we had several of our Enoch seminar meetings. And the first thought I had, maybe we should have a conference on this issue, because one conversation, one book presentation, of course, is not enough. And I think that probably we should organize some conference on the subject of early Christology, because so many things have come out in these last years, and we probably will need to have a much longer conversation. I have a lot of questions, but I will start from a basic question. You started making the claim that high Christology, not only Christology, but also high Christology or divine Christology is a variant of Second Temple Jewish Messianism and should be considered as such. You are not the first one to make this claim, Robert, because this claim was made by Boyarin, was made by Hurtado, was made by Hermans, was made by myself. And I could not agree more, of course. Jim Graft. I mean, so I think that is not a new statement. I repeat, I think it's an important statement to repeat, because in which sense, so before asking my question, I would like to ask you a preliminary question. In which sense you see your work as adding something to this conversation? Okay, of course, in which sense you think that you are presenting a perspective that is a little bit different, or is adding something to the previous conversation, So I would like to ask you these direct questions, okay, in relation to other authors that have already made this claim in recent years, a claim that I repeat, I completely agree upon, and I think is essential. I mean, we should certainly overcome this kind of divide between Christology and Messianism. Christology is simply Christian Messianism, I mean, or early Christian Messianism. I mean, there is no other definition that should be more appropriate. But I will start from this question more directly.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Of course, I'll draw on works done before. Like one could, also mention William Horbury or John Collins, of course. Yes. I think the big difference between my work and what people like Hurtado or Richard Bauckham and Charles Gieshin and others from the early High Christology Club have argued is that, of course, they also look at similar texts, but their overall aim is actually to find the difference between what can be defined in Second Temple Judaism and what we find in the New Testament. So scholars like Hurtado and Bauckham, they define early Jewish monotheism in a particular way. So they say, for a figure to become part of the one divine identity, or however they phrase it, this kind of criterion, this kind of aspect is necessary. So for Hurtado, it's like what he thinks is devotion. For Richard Bauckham, it's taking part in the act of creation, and so on. So, and from this kind of definition of Second Temple monotheism, they always argue within the New Testament we actually find something totally new. So they would argue New Testament authors, they take all these earlier traditions, but there's one major shift which already happened, which we can already see in Paul, that the Messiah or Christ is not only in some kind superhuman, but now he's part of one divine identity. And this is one big difference. So that's what more or less all members of the early High Christology Club, which look at the same text, argue. So they always look at the difference. And what I try to argue is exactly the opposite and say, I don't think it's helpful to only focus on the difference. Of course, there are some differences between New Testament Christologies and Messianism, as history always goes on, and new motives, new ideas, new texts come up. But I neither think there's one uniform definition for Second Temple Jewish monotheism, nor do I think that there's one big shift happening between Messianism and what we find in New Testament Christologies. But I do think they still take part in the same discourse. And if we would have asked Paul or whoever, what are you doing there? He would say, I'm doing kind of Messianism, a specific kind of Messianism. And there's no one major shift, except that they think and believe it's now Jesus who is the Messiah. So I think closest of all of them is probably Daniel Boyarin, although I think he goes maybe a bit too far, but yeah, I think that's the biggest difference between my work and what scholars like Hurtado do or have done.
This brings me to the second question, in the sense that, of course, there is not one early Christian Christology. I don't know, the Christology of Paul is very different from the Christology of John, and of course, there are different nuances, of course, and there are different perspectives. I mean, even the concept of divinity is not monolithic. I mean, and of course, this is also in relation to the Jewish environment, to the Second Temple Jewish environment and the Greco-Roman world. There are different degrees of divinity. So even when we define a divine Christology, in reality, we are not defining a single notion. I mean, because there are different forms of divine Christology, or different forms of divine Messianism. Because while I would agree, for instance, that all first Christians attribute to Jesus the attribute of divinity, this attribute is attributed to Jesus in very different ways in Paul or in John or in the Synoptics, exactly as in Jewish Messianism. The parables of Enoch has a different view of divine Christology than, I don't know, the Psalm of Solomon. we may say in general that the Messiah was understood as divine by many texts in Second Temple Judaism, but of course the Messiah was attributed different degree of divinity by different groups of different texts. I repeat, the Messiah in the parables of Enoch has a different degree of divinity than the son of David in the Psalm of Solomon, for instance. So there is nothing like divine Christology, and of course Paul. In Paul, the fact that Paul, for instance, does not call Jesus Theos, while instead this is present in John, it means that they have a different understanding of what divine Christology is. So I think, for instance, I mean, in your book, you correctly stress diversity, okay, because diversity is a key, is a key notion, okay. Diversity in Second Temple Jewish Messianism and diversity in Second Temple. I think we should at the same time probably to stress a little bit more diversity in divinity, put this way, okay? Because the concept of divinity is extremely diverse. I agree with you, for instance, that because this is a point I also made in my work. I mean that. The distinction between human, super angelic, and divine does not work, because the language in antiquity is different. The concept of divinity was attributed also to other beings than God, than the only God. Okay. So, which makes very complicated. I mean, angels are divine, the Messiah is divine, exalted figure are divine. So, but of course, they are not divine the same way. The same in the Greco-Roman world. I mean, the emperor is not as divine as Zeus, and is not as divine as a demigod, because there are different degrees of divinity. These different degrees of divinity were even codified and discussed in the Greco-Roman world. So when we say that the emperor was God, they understood something different, because then the emperor is Zeus. The emperor is divine, but is not Zeus, because he has a different degree of divinity. I don't know. I mean, this is just to show how complicated. But I repeat, I agree completely on the fact that any kind of discourse that we have in early Christianity should be considered as a variant of Second Temple Jewish Messianism, as a variant. I mean, of course, as a variant with these special features, which in turn Jewish Messianism is part of the Greco-Roman world, so should not be separated from the conversation on divine beings that we are having. And surprisingly, ancient Jews in the first and second century share very similar ideas to people in the Greco-Roman world. I mean, for instance, in their view of divinity, and in their view of existence of different degrees of divinity, they didn't differ very much from their fellow Greco-Roman. So in this sense, the conversation was very, very close.
Thanks, Gabriele. So I actually totally agree with you. So the concept of divinity or early Jewish monotheism, it's way more complicated than some scholars believe it to be. And I think that's a major problem with scholars like Hurtado and others, that they work with a uniform definition, what they believe to be early Jewish monotheism, and then they take this and try to show the New Testament works different or whatever. So there Jesus made the one shift from being just superhuman or an angel to being part of the one God. So in my book, I actually try to shift, all this discussion, because in most texts we have from Second Temple Judaism, and even in some texts New Testament, we simply don't know if certain aspects used in a Messiah or in Christ are understood by the specific author or the corresponding group to argue for what kind of divinity the figure has. So it's clear it's kind of superhuman, but we simply don't have the context, to argue. So like Fourth Ezra is on this level of divinity, and say the parables of Enoch are here, and the prophet Elijah in the book of Malachi is here. So it's difficult to compare them, and even in the text itself, it's almost impossible to argue how high is it, except from a few texts where we do have this kind of notion, like in Revelation. We have in Revelation 19 that taking up the tradition that it's not allowed to worship angels. Mm-hmm. So in this context, when it's said in Revelation 19, it's not allowed to worship angels, it's significant that Christ is venerated in Revelations 4-5. So I do think it's appropriate to argue that, at least for the author of Revelation, worshiping a figure besides the one God means that he's put in a status more or less on the same status than the one God, because we have in the same text, so by the same author, also kind of the idea what he thinks is necessary for a figure being not just human, but being part of the one God. But for many texts, we simply don't have this context, and it's difficult to answer.
And if I may add, it's very interesting because that before Revelation, we have only the prohibition of worshiping humans, not angels, which for me is a very interesting shift, because it means that something had changed in the understanding of the divinity of Jesus. That was considered divine at a very early stage. I completely agree. I mean, and this was also the point of Herman. No, there is nothing. We don't have a low Christology, okay, that opposed to a high Christology, okay, because in reality, since the beginning we have high forms of Christology, but at the same time, we have different kind of high Christology, different kind of, and so in some cases, high Christology does not imply the prohibition of worshiping angels, and then later on instead it implies this problem, which means that a different degree of divinity was given to Jesus. So in any case, thank you very much. I mean, I will have 1,000 other questions, but for me it's very important that we started this conversation. Hi, Paul, how are you? Because, and I think that probably now that we have so many works, so many contributions in the field, we will probably need not only to have a book review, but something more, because this shift in paradigm, and considering Christology as part of the Second Temple Judaism, would need some, I mean, a much longer discussion, okay? Because it's very rich, and it's very complicated, and very promising also too.
Yeah, excellent. Christopher Kaiser posted a question in the chat. Chris, if you'd like to join us on screen to vocalize your comment, please accept my invite to become a panelist. While Chris is working on that, we'll turn to Paula. Paula had a comment in the chat.
Yes, I was thinking with some of the ideas Robin put out, and thinking partly with beyond the Judaism-Hellenism divide, and what all Jewishness by the plus first century being manifestations of Hellenism. If we look at Jewishness in this period as a type of paideia that uses particular vocabularies maybe, but it's all a form of Hellenistic thought. Does that reconfigure how we consider this issue? And I'm anxious about, I mean, we're in a bad position as historians. We're trying to make distinctions so we can trace out developments. but would the people in the period have been thinking of themselves as pulling, here's something from Judaism and here's something from Hellenism? I don't think so. So just, I'm a Paul within Judaism person, and I'm now arguing for a Judaism within paganism perspective on Roman and late Roman period Jewishness.
That's a really interesting thought. Do others want to respond?
I love the way that you put that. I think that's fabulous. And for me, the problem is always just treating each of these authors with all of the cautions about textual tradition and survival, operational and what I say, but making sure that we treat what they show us seriously in terms of their paideia, in terms of their cross references and their technical terminology. That's really my concern. What we do as historians in terms of extrapolating more information from those cues is almost, it's not a different thing, but it's something that we need to keep in tension in terms of how we approach these texts, which is why I just think we need to be careful. And again, I love the way that you put it. Would they have distinguished, I'm now doing Judaism and now I'm going to bring in some terminology from Hellenism? No, I don't think so. I think that these are all concepts that are out there that they're trained with, or that they see as explanatory for the way that they're understanding the cosmology that they're trying to describe, or the Christology they're trying to describe.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
If I may, Paula and Robin, I think that it is possible now, Paula, to make this perspective of Paul within Hellenism, okay? Because we have rediscovered Paul within Judaism. Okay, I mean, the problem. I mean, we started from a problem in which, the idea was that Christianity was not Jewish because it was Hellenized. Okay, so but in the moment in which we have established the idea that Christianity belongs to Judaism as a Second Temple Jewish, these authors are Second Temple Jewish authors, and Christology is a form of Second Temple Jewish Messianism. At this point, we can locate Second Temple Jewish Messianism within Hellenism.
Right.
So without having this problem of separating Christianity from the rest, from the other Jewish movement of the time. But I perfectly agree with you. I mean, with both of you, that this kind of divide between Judaism and Hellenism doesn't make sense, because at the end we discovered that Jews and pagans had very similar views of the divine, of the concept of the divinity. I mean, surprisingly, Jews were using the same kind of discourse that was used in the pagan world. I mean, in terms of different degrees of divinity that were applied to different people, or to different beings, to different superhuman beings, etc. So, but I think we can again stress how these ideas should be understood within the Greek and Roman world, exactly because of the work that we have done to locate these texts and these authors within Judaism.
Right. Yeah, I think that one of the issues is what I see in the early high Christology movement that Bauckham and Furtado represent is an attempt to firewall the Jesus movement from forms of Hellenism, which is amazing when you think that the earliest evidence we have is Paul's letters. And he's living in a Greco-Roman cosmos that ultimately derives from Aristotle, right? Right. So and that's just the planet he lives on. It's in the middle of the universe. And so I don't know, our vocabulary, our represent blunt instruments for the kind of work we're trying to do. And I try to conceptualize this in terms of Venn diagrams and things like that, diffusion, things like that. But it's this issue of the false clarity that our own analytic terms force us to. I mean, talking about paganism when it's just a myriad of indeterminate, local, different ways of humans dealing with the divine, and yet we reify it into paganism because it saves time when we're trying to analyze this stuff. So I was just acquainting everybody with my standard mental cramp at this point, historiographically, in terms of the way historiography affects how we do our history. That's it. Thank you.
Eric, I think, had a response initially, Paula, to what you were saying. Eric, I don't know if you'd like to continue now that Paula has responded with that comment.
No, very simply, I find what you say, Paula, very, very interesting. But I only have one, not objection, but just one question. Let's say, in this way, don't we cancel the possibility of having a kind of resistance from Judaism to Hellenism, in just seeing Judaism as forms of Hellenism, or just more Hellenized forms of Judaism? I don't know if it is clear.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite grasp what you're.
When you say that all Judaism in some way is a form of Hellenism, or it's Hellenized, Judaism is all these different forms of Judaism are all Hellenized in some way. Don't we in some way just erase the possibility that we have a form of Jewish resistance to Hellenism, something that some Jews that did not want to be Hellenized? I don't know, for instance, the Enochians, Enochic Judaism, are they Hellenized or not? Sometimes I really think that they are not. They're not interested in what Hellenism has to say. And they just go back to more ancient Jewish traditions that are not canonical, maybe, but are Jewish and not Greek.
Yeah, I think after Alexander went through the neighborhood, in minus 333, it's hard to have a form of anything that's not affected by Greek thought. That doesn't go just for, and I keep using Jewishness because again, we're reifying Judaism into one thing when it's not a translocal phenomenon. It's not even uniform in one particular place, as we know from Alexandria. So and look at Maccabees. That's a perfect example of a resistance to Hellenism, and it's using Greek, and it's thinking Greekly while resisting a political aspect of Greekness, but it's completely absorbed a Hellenistic frame of mind. So what I'm arguing for is, I guess, more confusion, which doesn't really help us, but being more cautious about making these distinctions is all I'm suggesting.
Any other thoughts on that strand? If not, I will return to a comment that Robin had made in her presentation.
I agree with Paula.
Yeah.
I mean, our terminology we know has been difficult, and again, this is to go back to Dr. Booner's book, why something like a concept along the lines of linguistic community is helpful, right? Because you're pointing out that you want to bring a different discourse into the conversation. Now we can quibble about what we mean by words like community, right? And what that implies. And I think this gets at what Paula has been helping us recognize, is that when we use words like Hellenism, and even when we talk about Judaism instead of Judaisms, our categories create all kinds of mischief, certainly. But I think that if we can maintain a dynamic tension in these texts, again, looking at what the author brings to bear in terms of information about their own positionality, what's their terminology, their structure, their language, their cross-references. You can tell Paul is using the Septuagint, right? Like these are conversations that we can fruitfully have that give us a more precise scope in terms of the kind of literature that we're engaging.
John Campion is
if I may, I mean, the point is exactly what I was trying to make. I mean, that unfortunately, in the past, okay, there was this profound divide between Judaism and Christianity, and Judaism and Hellenism. And then Christianity, the development of Christology was seen as a corruption of the Jewishness of Christianity because of the influence of Hellenism. Of course, and of course, as a reaction to this view, of course, we have to say no. I mean, early forms of early Christology are not a corruption from Hellenism. Is part of a conversation that the entire Judaism, in all its different forms, is having within the Greco-Roman context. Okay, yeah. So this point is possible. I mean, I think it is at this point. It is important to discuss how Judaism is a component of the Hellenistic culture, but all forms of Judaism.
John Campion, welcome.
Thank you. This is a wonderful discussion. Regrettably, I have not had a chance yet to read Professor Buhner's book, so I come on screen a little reluctantly. The 2 points that I did want to make, first of all, the question of looking at the question of messianism, there's a certain poverty even in the use of that term in terms of it seems to me its limitations. It's looking at a very specific phenomenon within Second Temple Judaism. For example, it's related to eschatology, but eschatology is much broader than that. It's related to the pre-existence of wisdom, which is a much broader category. I actually kind of worry about the use of the term to describe the phenomenon that we're trying to get at in this particular discussion. So that's one comment. The second comment on this Hellenistic Judaism question is some concern as we probe the dimensions of various New Testament writers using the within Judaism category. I wonder whether we tend to lump Christianity, in this case represented by the New Testament writers, and Christianity is a poor representation to talk about the phenomena related to that. I wonder whether we shouldn't become more discerning with regard to the New Testament writers and how they interact with the Hellenistic Judaism that we're talking about. For example, we make some distinctions between Enoch, generally regarded as Palestinian Jewish literature, and distinguish that perhaps from Philo, Alexandrian. I'm wondering whether we need to be more discerning with regard to where different writers fit within the various movements of Judaism that were available at that time, and not view the New Testament writers as one distinct movement within that, but rather see them as fitting into different Jewish movements during that time. For example, in broad categories, diaspora Judaism versus Palestinian Judaism, that sort of thing. And that in my case led me to look at the book of Matthew, particularly with regard to the phenomenon of sectarian Judaism. I don't think Mark fits that category, or any other gospel writer. But to see it as located within a very specific movement within Judaism, and I wonder whether we don't need to be looking at other New Testament writers in that same way, and looking at the specific movements or contexts within different Jewish communities at that time. Is something that I've been concerned about and watching as this kind of within Judaism kind of approach took hold more broadly.
Ruben, do you want to take the first opportunity to respond to that thought?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, John. I think that's right. That's something we should do. Like, let's say, for instance, for Paul, it's simply to say that Paul is within Judaism is actually not much. Of course, he was a Jew. The actually more interesting question is what kind of a Jew, was Paul, and we could ask the same questions for all New Testament authors. But I'm not that sure that it's helpful, or that we are even able to to choose specific labels. Let's say to sectarian Jew or diaspora Jew. We simply don't know enough about Second Temple Judaism at the time of the New Testament to put some New Testament authors to a specific group. We can only relate them to specific ideas or specific traditions or what else is important for them, but we're probably not able to label them with specific kind of categories. That's my first thought.
I think John also posed a question about the language of Messianism in and of itself, the definition of it. Definition of Messianism. I mean, it's a crucial and at the same time very difficult approach, and scholars still, writing books about Messianism, like Matthew Navinson, take very different approaches than I did in my book. So, I mean, on the one side, there are definitions like a Messianic figure. What we call a Messianic figure is simply like a positive eschatological agent or positive eschatological figure at the end of something like that. And I think, when we talk about linguistic communities or linguistic metrics, I don't think it's helpful to stick our definition of Messianism to one specific term or title like Messiah. I think people were able, to understand that they're talking about, that they're engaging in a similar discourse, even if one has used the title like Messiah, but the other has used different titles like, I don't know, God's anointed or Son of David or even something else. But they're always talking about a positive figure which God will send and at some time in the future or even now. Yeah, that's what I think is the most appropriate definition for Messianism. Yeah. Eric?
But just to continue the story, but isn't Messianism a category that is totally foreign to Hellenism, to any kind of Hellenistic philosophy or view of the world? Something totally foreign, I guess. Isn't it? I don't know, it's a question.
The term, oh no, I'll let Paula.
No, I was just thinking of Michael Pipard's book, The Son of God in the Roman World. I mean, there are different iterations of thinking about a savior figure. I mean, the other person in the Roman Empire who is called Savior and Son of God is Augustus. So it depends on where you're putting the accent on what you're thinking of about. Now, Augustus wasn't claiming to be the son of David. That's something else. But in terms of grosso modo, there are sons of God all over the Mediterranean. A lot of them people from the dead too. I mean, that happens a lot in the ancient Mediterranean. Robin, what were you going to say? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I didn't quote it all out in my talk because I was feeling long-winded in my response, but I mentioned Plutarch briefly. And he talks about noble ancestors after death floating up into the heavens to watch over people on earth. And there's a lot of discourse along those lines, but in the course of that conversation, he also, and he's not alone in this, names daimons and other kinds of intermediary figures, what we might call superhuman figures, including he uses the word soter. He talks about saviors that float around in heaven to come down and intercede in human events. The Dioscoroi is considered one of these kinds of, within this category as well. So this idea that you would have superhuman, I don't like to use supernatural because this is the natural world for them. But this is kind of the cosmology that exists and is shared across the Mediterranean world. And this idea that you would have a savior and whether, and then this is actually just corresponding and dovetailing to exactly what Dr. Booner just said, which is whether you use the word Messiah or not, the concept is operational to various degrees, I think, across literature, especially in the first century.
Before we go to Eric, Robin, someone in the chat a while ago asked for that citation from Plutarch. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I'll put it in. I didn't see but I was actually thinking I should do it.
Thank you very much. Eric, we'll go to you.
Yes, so just what I was thinking about, it's not the superhuman or the Son of God or whatever, but the idea of a Messiah comes to put an end to this world and to start a new world, a new era, totally, not just politically like Augustus or the emperors, but really turning the world upside down. This is what I think, what I was thinking about.
If I may, Eric, I don't think that we should, of course, the Messiah, I mean, as feature in Judaism that are different from what we find elsewhere. I mean, at the same time, this discourse about saving figures is part of a broader conversation. I don't think that we have to pursue this put of line, this is completely original or this is not. Of course, we are reacting against the idea that that Christianity took these ideas not from Judaism, but from Hellenism, and so they came from outside. And no, this was already part of the Jewish discourse. And of course, within Judaism, these figures were understood in a way that is different from the way in which they were understood outside the Jewish religion. On the other hand, they were part of a broader conversation. So I don't think that necessarily we have to make a decision in the terms that you presented. I mean, of course, each movement has its own special features. I mean, and of course, the understanding of the Messiah, I repeat, in Judaism, had its own special figures. But on the other hand, it was part of a much broader conversation. And I think that this is what we are saying here today.
Let's turn to Rebecca. What do you think about these comments and reflections, sectarian and Messianism, and the definition of Messianism? We've talked about a couple of different things.
Yeah, thank you. I was glad to see this come up. And John, thank you for your comments, and Gabriele just now on thinking about the category of Messianism and if it's perhaps too limiting in terms of thinking about New Testament Christologies. And I think that's what Dr. Buna was also, I think that's part of the larger focus of the book, is trying to get away from some of these limitations. And I saw that as one of the strengths in some of the texts that Dr. Buna engaged. But I think it stood out to me in particular with the use of the Self-Glorification Hymn, because it's a text that I personally have not considered within the lens of Messianism, but I think is relevant to this discussion. So thinking about New Testament Christologies and this, the way that divinization, or the way that the Messiah, or the way that Jesus is related to God in the New Testament, how that relates to other texts that may not even be considered messianic or representing a Messiah figure, I think is an important part of this discussion that maybe hasn't been engaged very thoroughly yet.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bob Costello is joining us.
Thank you. Dr. Buna, I have a question, and I apologize because twice I have not read your book, and I had another meeting, so I actually came in the middle of Dr. Walsh presenting her question. So, but I keep hearing self-glorification hymn being brought up, and the first time there was some contrasting between the descriptions there and the descriptions of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit in the synoptics. So my question for you is that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are comparisons outside of the self-glorification hymn to that concept of the Holy Spirit engaging in a transformation of a human. In the Hodayot, there's descriptions of the Holy Spirit being spread over a human and resulting in a type of transformation. And I was wondering whether you engaged with any of that or not, or did you think that that wasn't really fitting that sense of Christology versus just divinization?
Thanks for the question. I maybe should have looked at it, but I simply didn't. So I don't know much about the Pneuma in the Hodayot, but maybe someone else knows.
Maybe just a quick comment. I think Carol Newsom recently wrote a book, The Spirit Within, that engages that concept in terms of agency, that she deals a lot with that language in the Hodayot, the Spirit Within, or the Holy Spirit embodying or coming within a person.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that volume. I haven't read it. Ruben, Chris Kaiser asked a question a while ago that kind of deals with this question of messianism and types. And unfortunately wasn't able to join us on screen, but Christopher Kaiser asked, given the fact that the various divine Messiah ideas were just one of many such views in early pre-normative Judaism, Chris's language, why would so many New Testament traditions have picked up on that particular outlook? And why were divine Messiah motifs not applied to other Jewish men in recent memory? Would you mind answering Chris's question?
So the why question in historical developments is it's a tricky one, but so actually we don't know much or actually anything about other actual messianic figures at the time of the New Testament. So we have a lot of other messianic texts where we don't have evidence, a lot of evidence of other, real persons where others said this is kind of the Messiah and what they thought about him. So it's hard to compare Jesus as an actual messianic figure with something we don't have, even if it might, even if it might have been there, but we don't know about it. So as I try to point out at the end of my book and also in the overview I gave at the beginning, I think it's reasonable to argue that the depiction of Christ, or the idea that Christ is more than human, I think it's possible that this started already at his lifetime, so that at least people who saw him or engaged with him believe that he was not just a human Messiah, but some kind of human Messiah. So when the idea started something there historically, then it's conceivable why most or all New Testament authors took this idea and further developed it.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much, Gabriele. You had a comment?
Yes, Ruben, just a question, maybe because beyond your book, but just to understand what your answer would be. You know that Bockman and Hurtado try to say that there was never like a low Christology in early Christianity, but the Christians since the beginning understood, or since a very early stage, understood Jesus as God. Okay. Then Hermans came, and also myself, and say, okay, wait a moment. Okay. The fact that Jesus was understood at a very early stage as divine does not mean that he was understood as God, because the two things are different. Okay, so our criticism was, yes, we have at a very early stage Jesus presented as divine, so a divine Christology applied to Jesus, but the idea that Jesus was God, okay, is at the end of the process, not at the beginning. Okay, and so I would like to ask you, when do you think that Christians began to understand Jesus as God? Because I mean, Paul does not, the synoptics do not. Okay, we may argue that John does, at least in terms of language, and then I don't know, in the letter of Ignatius, we have already the definition of Jesus as our God, which is not part of the language of Paul. So we have I see that Paul already wrote 4th century. I understand why. I mean, and again, it depends also what it means to be God. But certainly we see, or I see a process of development in the idea of the way in which Jesus was understood as divine. Okay, I don't know if we can talk of a lower high Christology, of the higher high Christology. I don't know, but we have the problem also of the development and the progress of Christology, provided that Christians since a very early stage understood Jesus as divine. Certainly, it seems that certainly Paul did not understand Jesus as divine in the same terms that the 4th century church father understood him.
So I think that this question is almost impossible to answer because of diversity of monotheism or divinity, and we simply, for most New Testament authors, don't know how they define what they think is unique for the one God, and so we don't know if they deliberately, put it on Christ or if they don't. So I think if we would have Mark and John in this room and ask them which one of you has a higher Christology or whatever, they might have answered different than we thought. I mean, we all would say, of course, John is the higher one or whatever, but I'm not sure Mark would agree with him. Maybe he would simply say, I mean, calling him theos or logos, it's simply not what I do. It's not within my vocabulary or within my concept of divinity, but maybe the divine pneuma coming on him in his baptism is for him the crucial point. So I think we have some places in the New Testament, like I said before, like in Revelation, where I think it's clear that Revelation already, we can argue that Jesus is not just divine in the sense of some kind of superhuman, but he's already God or part of the one God. But for many other New Testament texts, we simply, I think, don't know, because we don't know the concept of divinity the specific author has. And maybe they themselves don't know it either.
I feel compelled to add that Paul does think that Christ is sharing in God's pneuma. He calls him Lord and thinks he defeated death. So those are all pretty good. in terms of, giving him some kind of divine status, I think. So then it just does come down, and I'm trying here to support what Dr. Booner is saying, in the sense that, there are shifts here in terms of points of emphasis, back to, is the pneuma bestowed upon Christ at baptism, or is it at birth, or is it at resurrection? You can make that case for Paul. So, I mean, not easily, but it could be done. So, I mean, these are distinctions about when the divinity takes place, perhaps, but not that he is divine.
Yes, but again, there are different degrees of divinity. Okay, that's the problem. For Paul, God the Father is the head of Christ. So this is subordinated.
No, and the same in Stoicism. The God is rationality.
Exactly.
And it's that rationality that permeates the universe that gets, concentrated in different tensions and different situations, right? So certainly in Stoicism, you would have had the same thing, because the God itself is rationality that permeates everything. It's not, so not everything is God, right? So I agree.
Reading this text, I agree to a large extent of Ruben. There is a lot of things that we don't know and we will wish to know. Okay, but certainly there is some different in I don't know. In Paul, we don't have a concept of incarnation, so we don't have the idea of incarnation of the logos. We don't have the logos. We don't have the logos becoming flesh. So we do have a different understanding of the relation between the Father and the Son. Even the choice of the term kurios means that for Paul, Jesus is different from theos. Okay, and we don't have the phrase Jesus our theos like we have in the 2nd century. So in the 2nd century, Christians are referring to Jesus as our God, our theos, which is a language that is unknown in the 1st century. So it means that we have a shift in emphasis. So, but I would agree with you. I mean, Jesus is a divine being in Paul, but in a different way, in my view, more similarly to what we may find, I don't know, in the parables of Enoch than in the Gospel of John. Okay, so we can say in all these texts we have a divine Messiah, but the view of a divine Messiah is very different from one text to another, because to this divine being, different degrees of divinity are attributed and a different relationship with the one God. So it's extremely complicated. We see that there is, of course, Christians in the 1st century are not saying the same things that they will say about Jesus in the 4th century. Okay, so that's very different. But okay. At the same time, I think that we have a progress of ideas. I mean, and in this sense, probably, even though, Ruben, we don't have a specific voice from these authors, chronology seems to be, let's see, significant in terms of understanding the kind of notion of divinity that was attributed to Jesus.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time for today. Ruben, I'd like to turn it back to you. Do you have any closing comments for us?
I think we tipped a lot of different questions related to my book and beyond. Thank you very much for engaging with my thoughts, my books, and engaging with the topic itself. And I think the idea of Gabriele to continue this conversation with some kind of other place or conference, and to argue to especially look at what is divinity in Second Temple Judaism, what kinds of approaches can we find, how they're related to paganism or whatever. I think that would be great. Yeah. So thanks a lot to everyone.
Thank you, Ruben, for your thought-provoking book, and Robin and Rebecca for your comments. Please, everyone, let's join me in giving them a round of applause. Please mark your calendars and join us for our other 2023 events. Our next RES review is on Jonathan Adler's The Origins of Judaism, an archaeological historical reappraisal on October 11th. If you've not already done so, please consider joining the Enoch seminar and staying connected to our events. Thank you, everyone, for your presence today. I wish you well. Until next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua, for all your work.